Wait a minute. It's supposed to be Anthony opening
Hello,
it today.
ladies and gentlemen. I am Anthony Smith, lead economist here at FreightWaves, and you're watching Freightonomics, and I am here with...
Zach Strickland.
Yes.
Director of Freight Market Intelligence.
Excellent. And today we have quite a show lined up for you.
Yes, we do. And Anthony's supposed to open the show today. He looked a little different on the camera there. For those of you viewing and those of you that are viewing, be sure to check out on LinkedIn, as Anthony, you will be monitoring for any of your comments or suggestions that are going in, Facebook as well. And we do have a pretty action-packed show today. We didn't bring on any guests, this week.
Back
not
to
this
basics.
Week. We need to bring it in.
Duo.
We take a minute every now and again just to bring it back in, make the show, take it back to its core, get some synergy going between me and Anthony. We haven't talked enough lately. So we figure we're going to have a little discussion today about how the election cycles and the election outcomes themselves impact the overall economy. But we also have some stories to cover. And I believe today was actually a pretty strong story day, Anthony Smith.
Yes.
Some of these that I pulled out is kind of a rehash of what we talked about a few weeks ago, but I think it's worth mentioning as this is an ongoing story, in my opinion, in terms of the driver shortage. Driver shortage becoming another buzzword in the industry yet again. For years, we kind of heard about this driver shortage being the reason that, you can't really keep rates where they are. And it was kind of, I think more of a, hey, this is not working out for me for some of these larger carriers, because a lot of what happens is they have these excessive amounts of turnover. There's high amounts of cost involved in this turnover. Some of these carriers experiencing as much as 100% turnover a year, which means that they are turning over their entire driver size. So if they had 10 drivers, they would literally have either they would quit or fire and then replace those 10 drivers every year. And of course, we're talking about probably hundreds and thousands of drivers for some of these larger carriers. And there is a ton of cost involved in that. So now we're talking about driver shortage yet again, but it's a different set of circumstances. Did you read this article, Anthony, by Alan Adler?
Alan Adler puts out some great things, and there's a few key issues that I think were outlined in this one, especially one I think was older drivers.
Yeah, the pandemic obviously has had a huge impact on, the whole world. But specifically when we're talking about the drivers, a lot of these drivers are now saying, like, you know what? I'm going to socially distance myself, not in a truck.
Yeah. And I think so. I don't want to go down this entire lane because I could. I mean, this can be like another 30-minute show on it.
We're not going to do that.
This goes back to a whole nother situation where there should probably be, we could like slowly zoom in on the cameras. Like there can be like this entire industry shortage that's kind of being driven by this younger generation that's being pushed into college or universities that where they should be taking up a trade because they're just going to be burdened with this debt that they're never going to use for this degree that they didn't really want. But now they're making these crazy decisions at 17, 18 years old. What am I going to do for the rest of my life with hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt when maybe I could become a millionaire by starting my own transportation logistics company, and here I am with debt, and it's just older drivers.
Yeah, older drivers,
for younger drivers, and
except Anthony, 25% of the driving schools are still shut down.
Another bottleneck.
So we still got, on top of everything you just mentioned, we still have all these limitations placed on us by the COVID world, and also just the fact that, truck driving is not necessarily the most popular job that people are looking for at this moment. Length of haul, being away from your family, it is not the life for everybody. It is a hard life to live, especially for those over-the-road drivers. And in this article, which is specifically the results of the ATRI driver surveys that they put out every year tracking trucking's critical issues, and they ask drivers and carriers, what their main concerns throughout the year are going to be. And this was number one, the driver shortage being a thing, number one. And another interesting aspect of this article, and be sure to check it out on FreightWaves.com, there was little agreement over what were the most important issues between motor carriers and drivers. I know this isn't a huge shock, but at the same time, they prioritize things very differently, except for, obviously the drivers are more concerned about their day-to-day operational activities, whereas the motor carriers are more concerned about, kind of that macro activity. Drivers were, for instance, more concerned about delays at the shipper because that's, taking away their productive work time. Hours of service is more concerning to them versus the carriers themselves because that does interfere with their productivity. And then they get to hear about it and they don't get paid in their per mileage and their wage. So yeah, things that would impact my pay, I would be upset about and put a higher priority on as well.
Right.
Would you agree?
Completely makes sense.
Yeah. So next up in the stories, now this again is something that we've covered on the show in pretty deep detail. Prologis sees logistics space in short supply by early 2021. Of course, Prologis, big warehousing, third-party warehousing provider throughout the United States. They track a ton of information based on their, capacity constraints, how much inventory turnover, just the consumer activity in general. They have a lot of visibility into that because they are one of the largest providers in the United States, and they have warehouses all over the place. Basically, they're saying it's filling up.
Yeah, especially in those heavy, densely populated areas. I think it outlines Southern California, New Jersey, New York, Dallas, Atlanta. I mean, and that definitely makes sense because you're looking at these large metropolitan areas looking to get more and more closer or more, I guess, conveniently located, strategically located to that final consumer. And this makes all the sense in the world when we're looking at, I want to do same day shipping or next day delivery, things like that.
Yeah, this whole transition into the e-commerce, obviously there's been a boom of e-commerce on top of the already, we were already transitioning to the e-commerce world prior to COVID. It really just put it hammered down the accelerator pedal on that. It is growing significantly. And of course, this means that supply chains and suppliers have to adapt to consumer behaviors.
Yeah.
Which has been the theme of 2020. How do they adapt quickly? I mean, you're talking about supply chains that stretch all the way across the world. And they've got to figure out sourcing, warehousing, logistics, transportation, all these different facets of it over multiple providers in a largely outsourced environment.
Right.
It's a mess. I'm kind of glad that I'm sitting here talking to you.
Right. Yeah. Zach, I am here for you. The other thing that we had outlined was an article of a city locked down for 3 months.
Yes. So this was just interesting to me. This is not on FreightWaves.com. This is Bloomberg. Somebody that we've been compared to in the past for freight. Now, obviously, they encompass the entire world and globe and financial industry specifically, where they got their start. But this was an interesting article on Bloomberg, and it covered, Melbourne, Australia. They went through some of the strictest lockdown. And again, this is one of those big questions of 2020 going into 2021. Are we going to have to endure another lockdown? Are there going to be more restrictions placed on us? Some of these concerns obviously are going to be addressed in the election coming up, which we will hit here in a little bit. But this was a fascinating read to me in the way that they outlined, this city went through the most extreme lockdown procedure. It was one of the most extreme lockdowns that we know of in the free world. And they largely had the support of the population there. They're very complicit about, saying, okay, we'll be inside. But there was a tremendous economic cost to this, something that, again, we're no stranger to here in the United States either. But there were heavy fines levied on people that did not, they basically were put on curfew. They were only allowed outside for 1 hour a day for exercise. Shut down schools, restaurants, you name it. This was a lockdown.
Yeah.
And, they were seeing upwards, this happened in the summer or the winter there. July 7th is when it began, and it lasted till just recently. And the economic cost was just tremendous. Let me look at some of it was like 1,200 jobs a day in a city of 5 million people. And then they saw mental health, demand for health services rose 31% between September and October alone. Domestic violence spiked, alcohol consumption increased. They said a lot of these places, it's going to take years to recover from this in this one city.
Yeah.
And I think, I don't want to glaze over the fact that they were trying to obviously, prevent this spread of this virus and deaths, but there is a tremendous, there's a lot to be learned here, and something that I think a lot of people could take away that, even amidst their lockdown, there was a lot of spiking, through this virus. And so that's something that our leaders have to take into account is, did some sort of extreme lockdown actually did it mitigate it?
Yeah.
And how do you know?
And I think that's interesting. So we're looking at this, and in each country essentially, in almost each state essentially now, but each country on the onset of COVID-19, it was almost like, hey, this is an experiment. How are your results varying from our results? What's your strategy? What's our strategy going to be compared to how you're handling the outbreak? And so we've seen, I think, some of the more Nordic countries potentially do a little bit more herd immunity approach, while we're seeing some other countries just shutting borders off completely. I think New Zealand was one of those countries. And so it's really interesting to see how different countries are really being impacted by how they responded to this and how they continue to respond. I think we have a comment here from Phil Kuberth here, and he says, hello from the Pacific Northwest, and just wait till COVID vac distribution, talk about a challenge. And I think that's going to be another one that we hit on, I think, a couple shows ago. That's going to be a whole nother host of issues hammering the supply chain.
Yeah, there is no, and I read this and I'm basically sitting here going, I don't have a clear answer.
Yeah.
I have no idea what you should do. This is probably one of the more extreme measures to the side of, quarantining and locking down, which probably is a little overkill if you weigh it economically and, cost of, healthcare, impact to healthcare, et cetera. But there's the argument against it as well, or, for it, in the way that you're looking at some of these Nordic countries experience similar economic catastrophe if they don't do anything at all. Mm-hmm. So again, I'm kind of moderate in nature, but I kind of start to say, okay, let's see if we can kind of whittle down the window of what the balance of, social distancing, locking down, and keeping the economy. I mean, because, you may not see it explicitly in the numbers, of COVID costs here, but these outside influences such as domestic violence and mental health, people losing their jobs, that's going to have a long tail to it in terms of overall economic impact, as well as the, lifestyles, quality of life, life and death, even that we're not going to measure explicitly as related to a COVID situation. So I think that's obviously something that our leaders are struggling with at this point in time, and there's arguments for and against all of them. And I just think that was one of the more interesting reads that I came across. Everybody should check that one out if you are interested in getting, another perspective on this outbreak.
And I think that really hones in on a great point. I know we're going to hit in on impacts on the economy during election cycles, but I think this really hones in on there is not really a one-size-fits-all when we're looking at this whole situation. I mean, we're looking at just the U.S. It's not a one-size-fits-all, because if we just had one federal mandate right now, I don't think it would be applicable for each and every state, because each and every state's facing and even within the state, each and every county is facing a different situation. And so I think that just kind of goes to show is like, it's not a one size fits all at all.
So this fits right in. You've actually kind of walked into a little bit of a trap of mine that I did not intend on placing here, but you've walked right into it, and it transitions into something that I was going to mention later here as we were discussing. How does the election impact the economy and what's about to happen in this country? Now, obviously, I do not try to get into the politics. I think largely that's waste of time in general.
I'm getting into it.
Over voting for Trump or Biden. That's not what this is about. This is simply trying to kind of isolate some of the things that the election will have an influence over. Like if you vote for Biden, if you vote for Trump, obviously, if we were to hold any of our presidents accountable for the things they promised in the beginning of their cycles, that's a stat unto itself. There's been plenty of things promised and said in these elections that just never came to fruition. But in general, I think I wanted to hone it down to something very simplistic. And what you just said in terms of, I think that you need to give more decision-making power to, individual areas and states, that actually lines up with a Trump ideal. And again, maybe he goes through with it, maybe he doesn't if he gets elected, I don't know.
Or even more so libertarian.
Yeah, yes. He's the conservative side of the board tends to support exactly what you just said. And I'm not going to put you in a hole because...
Oh, yeah. I let my political beliefs be known here that I don't trust the government at all. I have no political affiliation. I am apolitical. I think that's the best way to approach economics, just from an
I agree 100%
point. But definitely, I mean,
go
just
with
from
what
a
makes
technocrat
sense.
standpoint. Yeah.
Yeah. Go with what makes sense. It doesn't, a Republican, Democrat, forget it. We're data people here. We like to go with what makes the most sense, what's supported, and there's not a single answer for everybody in a lot of situations. So that's one of the things that is listed as a discrepancy between the Biden and Trump campaign. And again, so if Biden were to win the election, one of the things that he would do is take more federal control of the response to COVID.
Yeah.
Now, again, I don't care which side of the aisle you sit on. That's something that he's promised to do, basically saying we need to have a more of a centralized approach in how we handle this, which can make a lot of sense. If you think about things, if I think about it in terms of business applications, there's a lot of functionalities that do make a lot of sense when you centralize them. Billing, for instance, collections, things that are controlled centrally, finances, things like that really make a lot of sense not to have different little areas, spread out over the company or the businesses. You want to have centralized control over those things. And this may be one of those things that works out better if it is centralized. You disagree with that. I tend to think I'm kind of in line with you. New York, just being in a smaller city, smaller town, not as population dense of an area, the studies definitely support that you cannot treat New York City the same way that you treat Chattanooga, Tennessee, right? Because we just don't have the density, we don't have the way of life, we don't have the infrastructure that is the same way. So from that perspective, I lean a little bit more on your end, and that could have a significant impact on the economy. Just like I was talking about with that Victoria, what's happening in Victoria over there in Melbourne, Australia. If you do take a more severe slant on things, and again, I'm not saying that Biden will, maybe he does kind of, just say, hey, we just want to have a little bit more centralized control over some of these policies, and you can still be left to do what you want to do in certain aspects. But that could definitely change the way that we see 2021 unfolding and the economic recovery.
Yeah. And I mean, just from a business standpoint, I'm loving Phil in the comments right now. He has an asterisk next to corporate tax structure concerns.
That's right on the list.
Yeah, and that's a whole nother one right there. And I think, so overall, just a wide brush right now from an economic standpoint, when I'm looking at election cycles and overall economic growth, I don't see a large impact on a long-term basis, just because near term, there's a lot of wait and see. We're going to wait and see who's going to get elected, what their policies are. And business owners are smart. Corporations are smart. They're intelligent individuals. And what they do is they wait and see what are going to be the policies that are in place, and then they act accordingly. So right now we might just be in the standstill of a lot of individuals waiting, like, all right, are we going to get Biden? Are we going to get Trump? Are we going to get Kanye? Are we going to get Joe Jorgensen? Are we going to, are we going to get the pizza party? And so they're waiting to see what's going to happen within the overall economy. Then they're going to act accordingly. And it's a brilliant move. And I love to see it because, of course, they're going to act in their best interest.
Well, they have to.
They have to.
One of the biggest influencing factors of that booming freight market in 2017 and 18 was the tax breaks.
Yeah.
The Trump tax breaks that are set to expire here next year, I believe. So it's basically a deferred depreciation. Again, tremendous amount of business investment in 2017, 2018. And it just fed itself. Now, the argument against it is that it overheated the economy. And then we suffered for it in 2019 into 2020 before COVID hit. And we're still suffering from it to an extent because basically what it does is they go out and they overspend. They spend all this money knowing that they're going to get the tax benefit of it in year one. and it has a definitive end.
Yeah, yeah.
And so you basically you overheat the front end, overstimulating things, and things kind of die down because what happens? They run out of cash.
Yeah, yeah.
And now we're kind of in that, again, who would have predicted COVID? But businesses are still sitting on a ton of cash right now due to two reasons: COVID-19, and they're waiting on this election, as you mentioned.
Yeah, it's going to be a big wait and see. I mean, even though we did see in the most recent durable goods orders, we saw an increase, a lot of that was more downstream on the consumer side. We're looking at motor vehicles. Surprising to see planes kind of coming back a little bit, but we did see some downward movement, I believe, in machinery. And I don't think that's too surprising. And then as we get into the latter months of 2020, we're going to have harder year-over-year comps when looking at the industrial sector because industrial production started to show some upward movement 2019 last year towards the end of the year. But definitely, I think there is, without a doubt, if I was a business owner, if I was a manufacturer, of course, I'd be waiting to see, okay, what am I going to have? What's going to be the playing field? It's like watching film of the team that you're about to go up against. Or am I going to be, are they pass heavy? Are they run heavy? Are they going to run the option? What do I have to prepare for? Or am I just going to be like Jolie Dunn in a 3-3-5 defense and just blitz every single down? There's going to be different tactics for different situations when you get on the field. And I think that's where a lot of business owners and corporations are going to be heading right now.
Yeah, and the major differences here are, of course, Trump's already had the example of where he's given the tax benefit. He would extend that benefit, he says, for how long, we don't know. But you could still take, but a lot of people would argue we've already kind of captured the benefit of the tax credits that he gave out there. But one thing that Biden says that he's going to do is he's going to increase the top corporate income tax rate to 28%. Again, I'm not going to claim to be some sort of tax accountant here. There's all sorts of nuances involved here that I will not bore everyone with. But this kind of overtly feels like, okay, corporate tax rate increases, but a lot of these companies, this is meaningless. This is a meaningless thing to say, even though a lot of people argue that, that'll just reduce their spending. They won't hire as many people, That's not necessarily true. It may not actually have any real impact at all. It's kind of one of those things that they go out and say, but most of these companies have all sorts of things working in their favor at the top tier. And this is almost a nothing kind of discrepancy, in my opinion. From what I know about this type of stuff, it is not, it's actually, the small businesses and new investment is really where I want the most tax breaks, if it's up to me. It's not this high-end, Walmart tax level type deal, which they know all about, know how to influence and get around it all day long. I'm more concerned about that small business aspect, which neither side really, explicitly, approaches in some of their policies. They really talk at a high level, and the way
that's where the majority of the business is.
Yeah. That's where most of the business is. How Biden kind of gets around this idea that he's going to tax the big businesses is that he's going to encourage a better growth in the environmental field. And basically, something we need, obviously, you can't just continuously cut down forests and then burn them up into the atmosphere as we're doing. And of course, it's, basically he's going to invest a bunch of money in the green initiatives, which is positive. It's federally backed because there's not a ton of incentive for people on their own to go out and create green businesses. Again, there's arguments of like, well, you need the private side. That's what the other side of the aisle would say, is that you need to privatize it and make it grow. Well, the private sector hasn't really shown that it really cares about that as much as the, and that is, in my opinion, one of the responsibilities of the, world governments to kind of keep that in check, because as we've seen over the Industrial Revolution, businesses will act of their own self-interest to the detriment of the populations if they are left unchecked. And that is fact.
And I think you hit the nail on the head right there, is where do incentives come into play? I mean, and it's on a very high level and on the individual level, because I think what we had here in the comments from Phil not too long ago talking about the driver shortage. He mentioned earlier on in the conversation about how the financial benefits from the unemployment benefits. I mean, and so there are financial incentives all across the board, whether it's on an individual basis, on a small business basis, on a mid-sized, large corporation. And that's really what I think is going to be one of the main drivers is what are those incentives and what are we pushing, people to do? I mean, we have Tom Heights right here in the comments saying every citizen needs to get in the game and stand up against long-term politics on both sides. Robert Hill, Chief Executive Officer here, saying most of the spot market in my sector has slowed down, and I believe that it's just that they need to see how the election turns out. And so really a lot of wait and see. And so I'm loving the comments here in this LinkedIn board right now. Timothy Dooner saying, what's a flea flicker? A double brokering. And so I love it. But I think there's a lot of great points being discussed here.
Yeah, no, and it's extremely important that people do understand what they're supporting and getting behind here. One of the things that has been a huge impact of the Trump administration, the trade tensions between us and China. Obviously, one of his top agenda items was to really decrease our dependence on China, and he's going to incentivize companies not to outsource, to nearshore, obviously, which has been, not that a lot of companies need more incentive to do that at this point, knowing that all the risks involved with, that they've encountered over the last 2 years in terms of geopolitical problems and as well as now biological problems. But those tensions are going to persist regardless of who's in the office. I know China would obviously prefer to get somebody else in there to settle that tension between these two countries, but it's ultimately up to the corporations to make these decisions. And China still has a huge population last time I checked, and a lot of infrastructure built around being basically the world's industrial production center.
Yeah. I mean, we've discussed it before, and I think that's a big point is that they've built their country around being the most affordable manufacturer in the world. They have literally been able to, not so much as of late, because I think they just had their latest GDP numbers come out and not too good, even for China's numbers, which I don't trust them putting out their own numbers either. But they've even been able
the only economy to grow.
Economy to grow. And so even when I see, they're building roads and ghost cities to nowhere, they have essentially built an infrastructure around being the most affordable and the fastest and the most strategically country to go to for any type of large-scale manufacturing. And I understand the dependency, or want to get out of that dependency and have nearshoring, or even domestic production. But being able to compete with that after what they've done that's really difficult to do. And so that's where it comes into incentives, right? So we're looking at these companies, these corporations. They're going to have some incentives for doing business overseas, whether it's tax breaks incentives, or being able to just be able to, move a little bit more quickly in the supply chain.
Yeah, and that's something that, obviously you, just like, we talked about it back in the day, you don't want to have too much of your customer concentration in one account or two accounts. Your top 10 accounts tend to drive your business decisions and your revenues overall, and then the rest of them tend to support all of those behaviors. You don't want to have one supplier, and you don't want to have too much, all your eggs in one basket. I know the cliche still persists right now, but we're coming up on a minute to go, Anthony Smith.
That's
and
wild.
I want to make sure, as we close down this political discussion, as now we've told you exactly who to vote for. And good news, a lot of you have already voted. There's been record numbers of that. Good for you. Go out and vote if you haven't, and
Do it.
Definitely get there. But Halloween is this Saturday, Anthony.
Oh, wow.
And my question to you today, best horror monster?
Monster? I don't know. Does the Creeper count from Jeepers Creepers?
Yeah, that'll work.
I might go with him.
I kind of am a fan of, and I don't know if you consider this a monster, but Samara from The Ring.
Ooh, that's good.
Was the first one that really gave me that like oogie, or that crazy, moaning girl from The Grudge. The Japanese horror just really
they take it to another level.
Gets in my.
It's like supernatural and monster at the same time.
Well, thank you so much for watching. Be sure to check us out every week, 2 p.m. Eastern Time. And be sure to download the FreightWaves TV app on podcast players everywhere. Look up Freightonomics or look up Freightcasts and get every FreightWaves podcast. Great quarter guys, what the truck, put that coffee down, and drilling deep and
drink more water.
Do that. You need to be hydrated.
Right.